So next, our speaker is Miss Emer Gilmartin, CEO of BelowHorizon and a researcher at Adapt Centre, Trinity College Dublin. Emer works with industry on applications of chatbot technology and is widely published on the science and application of spoken dialogue. I'm delighted to welcome Emer, who will discuss the opportunities and challenges around the use of these technologies for a range of targeted learner groups and domains. So please don't forget to post your questions for Emer. We will be having a questions and answers session after Emer's talk. And with that, I'd like to give a big virtual welcome to Emer. Emer, over to you.
Thanks for the lovely introduction. Hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be here to talk about dialogue technology, chatbots, and AI in learning because it's such an exciting time to be involved in remote and blended learning to not only meet the challenges of the new normal, but also to rethink how we create engaging learning opportunities for everyone. But I have to ask now if you've stopped breathing yet.
Okay, hi everybody. Well, I hope that short soundbite gave you an idea of how far from there we are yet with interactive voice agents, etc., for learning. And it also highlights something which is really, really important, and I've noticed all through the conference, which is it's not so much the tools, it's the design. That synthetic voice you just heard is quite good. It sounds pretty convincing, but humans breathe. And unless your sentences are conversation length or sentence length, about 6 to 10 words, when you're making a voice bot, it's never going to sound natural. People won't understand it because we're working on diminished working memory because speech is transient. So I'd just like to stress through this that the bots are not coming to get you. The bots are a tool which may or may not be useful to you. And so, as you can see, what's this? Bot bingo. I've been going to these conferences for years at this stage. And I've noticed that, in fact, I used to play this myself at conferences. You'll always get some of the people and things you see in there. And that's partly a problem because it's the dream. You're unlikely to go to a conference on automotive design and start hearing about, perpetual motion machines. They don't exist. They'll never exist. So there are expectations around interactive chatbots, spoken language, spoken dialogue machines at this stage, which you really need to be worried about. But anyway, so if you're bored also, you can actually play bot bingo on me. The dream is to talk naturally with systems. We've all heard about it. So on this talk, I'm going to very quickly go through some background on dialogue systems, and on their usefulness in education. I'm going to talk quite a bit about chatbots because chatbots have gotten so much oxygen recently and they are becoming almost a must-have with a lot of people. Then I'll give a little bit about myself, some research I've been doing, a little bit about the Mila system, which we've developed at BelowHorizon, and a little bit about a not-for-profit and charity organization we're also very heavily involved in, and then maybe some conclusions. Okay, so Dialogue 101, like we all talk, we all know what talk is, but when we stop to think about it, humans do an awful lot of things through spoken interaction. We do transactions, we buy things, we sell things, we build relationships. And in the tech field, all of this is called conversation. Now, it is very unlike the kind of conversations we'd like to have. But the most important thing to understand here is that utterances are things you say, do things. So you have this idea of speech, dialogue, acts, or moves. So for example, Jesus, it's kind of cold in here. I'm really getting cold is probably better interpreted as a request or an instruction to turn on the heating than a simple statement of my feelings at the moment. So in order for us to have successful communication, you must understand that speech act, not necessarily the words, but the intention behind it. And this leads to all sorts of problems of grounding and clarification, where we go over and back to make sure we both know what the other person is saying and thinking. And in this, there's an information state of the conversation, which is continually being updated. So conversation in general in speech tech is seen as a series of adjacency pairs, which you can think of as calls and responses. So for example, the classic, everything in every dialogue system, the hello world is an airline booking thing. And this is not because we need airline booking bots. The forums are quite good for this. It's because a lot of the research is based on some data that was there from a flight booking system about 25 years ago, and it's just lived on in infamy. So do you have a flight to Portland tomorrow? Yes, I have one at 4 p.m. and another at 9. That's an adjacency pair, question answer. But however, in this case, there was a little bit of ambiguity. Is that Portland, Maine or Portland, Oregon? Oh, Oregon. Oh yeah, yes. So you see, you've got this kind of call response, this almost two-part piece of dialogue, a pair, which then forms in sequences to create a kind of dialogue, the kind that we normally model. This is a very, very quick run through what a dialogue system is. And dialogue system is, if you like, the umbrella term for most natural language interfaces. So you'd hear terms like conversation user, you'll hear CUIs, conversational user interfaces, you'll hear dialogue systems, you'll hear chatbots. They're all part of this larger family. So what happens? So I have an idea, I want to say it. So in my head, my idea is, I want you to tell me whether you want a coffee or not. So I'll say that as, would you like a coffee? A speech recognizer will hear that and will hopefully resolve it into the words, would you like a coffee, or something close to that. Then a language understanding module will try to match that to something that is relevant to the system. So for example, if the system is a coffee shop system, and that is the assistant, it'll match it to offer coffee. And that's what's understood. And then the next thing, the response, sorry, that's backwards. We'll pretend that this is a customer dialogue system. And then in the response generation, it's, the next thing would be, yes, I do, or no, I don't, I prefer tea. So the customer here, sorry, this is, again, as I said, it's backwards. So the customer thing would be, no, I don't. Which is the idea that customer has, the system which is pretending to be a customer. And the response generation will be, oh no, actually I don't, thank you, which would then be sent to the synthesizer and received by, in this case, the coffee shop assistant. Start as you mean to go on, reverse everything. Okay, so hopefully you understand that more or less without too much of a mess. Okay, so that's a speech-to-speech or text-to-text system. You can then add multimodality, where along with the audio stream for speech, you have other streams coming in. You could have things like a camera, which can recognize gesture, it can recognize facial expression, it can understand posture. You could have extra acoustic tools, for example, which would understand the pitch of your voice and map that to features like happiness, engagement, and take a constellation of these features together, put them through a machine learning model, and come out with information which is relevant to the dialogue manager. In other words, information which will affect what the system says back to you. And those systems can then do the reverse and come up with an avatar which will give the appropriate expression, posture, gesture, tone of voice, and the appropriate words in the response. So, and it comes back out through natural language generation and text-to-speech and a graphical rendition. So speech in, natural language understanding, and spoken language understanding. Dialogue manager makes a decision of what to do with all of this. Natural language generation puts that into digestible form and sends it back out to the user. So these machines have been around for quite a long time, and I think everybody's familiar with the ELIZA example, which was the very early, Joe Weizenbaum did this very early version, which was to try and get a system which could chat with the user. And he was very clever in that he chose a Rogerian therapist. Now, a Rogerian therapist is a therapist whose method, if you like, is to more or less reflect everything back at you in order to elicit more from you. So for example, if you say, oh God, I don't know, I hate my mother, all it's hearing is, it's like that rover, rover, rover. All it's hearing is mother. And it has a rule somewhere that says, oh yeah, if I get mother in, ask something more about the family. So it'll come back with, tell me more about your family. Now, this was incredibly effective. And I think, I'm sure most people are familiar with, to the extent that the Weizenbaum's secretary was worried that he was in the room while she was talking to the system. She wanted privacy so she could really get to the nub of her problems with the system. So that the early goal was always this system which could, in some form, add companionship, which could talk with you rather than just do tasks. Later on in the 90s, James Allen and a lot of other researchers discovered that making a system talk and converse with you was actually incredibly difficult because the space of ideas that would need to be understandable and also expressible by the system was so huge. So they came up with what's called the practical dialogue hypothesis, which means that most systems from then on were based on a task. Now, there was a lot of work on AI planning, and then in the late 2000s, data-driven or machine learning methods came in. Around 2012, there was a real leap forward in the quality of natural language understanding. In other words, how well the systems understand. And then the chatbot revolution. So let's go on and just talk about how these can be used in education. So the essential advantage of any sort of voice or natural language interaction is actually that these interactions, people tend to form a relationship with something they think is human. And this can have great advantages in, there's a perceived agency on the part of the human in the agent, which leads to good results on retention. You get great results with, say, exercise coaches in retention if you get them to have a natural language interaction with the bot rather than simply filling in a form. It's very engaging as there's a conversation going on all the time. One that we often forget is patience. The bot is always on, never gets tired, and can repeat ad infinitum in different ways. So it's very good when you're dealing with different skills profiles among your learners. It's been generally used over the years in essentially STEM, because with STEM, the answer is generally something that's quite easy to identify, and so assessment is easy. Later and more sophisticated speech tech has been used in computer-assisted language learning, computer-assisted pronunciation training, and coaching. And it's very, very popular for assessment, mostly for economic reasons, because that's where the money is. Chatbots came along around 2013, 2014. They'd been around for a long time, but there was, as I said, there was an explosion. You'd better NLU. Now, the big conceit behind chatbots is a business idea, really, that if you have instant messaging or direct messaging and you can put your app in the channel, people don't have to open an app. And also, you're no longer an app on the desktop that's competing with other apps. You're a contact. You're in. So this had huge implications for commerce, which is why a lot of the very big movers put money into this. The other thing about bots is that they can be text or speech, and they also use a lot of rich media. So if you look at the example on the right, I looked for this a couple of days ago, and it was the highest on the list of top 10 chatbots as an education one. It's the only education one on the list, actually. So it's a little bot that teaches you a mini course. So as you can see, you've got your graphics, you've got your videos, you've got your carousel to choose different lessons, and you've got your social element at the bottom in that the bot, the users can talk to each other, the learners can talk to each other. This kind of thing can be great where the bot is used to mediate material, to answer questions, to form quizzes, to give instant feedback. It's quite good with companies for anything that's essentially a question answer table or an FAQ can be made far more engaging and active by using a bot. So it gets used a lot in onboarding. There are lots and lots of no-code platforms out there. So we're kind of, I used to say we were at the Dreamweaver stage with bots, if you think about it in terms of websites, but actually we're not. We're heading towards WordPress, where it's becoming so easy to put a bot together that there's very little cost involved. And there's even the opportunity of using a chatbot as the subject. In other words, that particularly for children, they build a bot to teach them about something else. So you get that kind of flipped curriculum, flipped classroom idea. So that's all very lovely. But there is one problem, which is, if you look on the left, yeah, well, I guess I'm thirsty, but maybe an espresso would be too much. I want to sleep tonight, so maybe something with milk, maybe a latte. No, cappuccino would be better. And could I make that a large one? Oh, and I really like the new uniform. That's a human. That's the kind of stuff you get from humans. On the right, button, one large cappuccino. So basically, with any sort of voice interface, the further you get away from a button, the more ambiguity you have and the more difficulty you have understanding, and thus more difficulty you have in fulfilling. So chatbots at the moment are moving in two directions. One is very much restricting the input from the user, so losing the natural language part. So essentially what you've got is a website or an app in the Messenger channel, and that can be incredibly useful. But I think most people are still thinking of more sophisticated ideas, and the chatbots now are moving towards more sophisticated ideas. We see a lot of academic research moving towards that. Okay, but there are other systems, and I'm just going to show you a few examples of systems that I personally have interacted with, and I can vouch for the fact that they are incredibly engaging. You feel like it's a person. So the first one is called SimSensei, and I'm just going to give you a very quick look at it.
I'm from Los Angeles.
Oh, I'm from LA myself. When was the last time you felt really happy?
When was the last time?
I
don't know. Yeah, I'm not someone who's really like...
So that system has got a lot of machine learning and AI behind it. That system has a system modeled on human behavior, which causes the agent to give the right sort of nods and winks and gestures back to the person. On the user side, it's detecting their expression, it's detecting the direction of their eye gaze, it's detecting some acoustic features in their speech, so it can decide. This particular one is often used as a sort of a virtual therapist in order to check for signs of depression. So with depression, you tend to get a lowered eye gaze and a flattened pitch curve. So yes, there are systems out there that can do that monitoring of engagement and then change course in order to keep a learner engaged, which is incredibly valuable. That one was made, as I said, for healthcare, and a lot are. But I'll just go on to the next one. This is the same backend, which is used in military training. Now, these systems are heavily funded by DARPA, which is where they get the money. So this one puts a soldier into a VR environment where they meet characters, where the characters are actually based on a situation that they could encounter on the battlefield, and they have to negotiate with people, they have to make decisions, etc., etc., etc. So you're going into that true immersive game learning, but the dialogue is of a lot higher quality than you normally get on a games platform.
Safe and supportive environment.
This one I particularly like.
My name is Pinchas Guter. I will answer any questions you might have for me.
How old were you when the war ended?
I was between the ages of 13 and 14 when the war ended in 1945.
Do you remember any songs from your youth?
This is a lullaby that my mother used to sing to me, and I still remember it. It's in Polish. Jadą dzieci, jadą drogą, siostrzyczka I brat, I nawidzieć się nie mogą, jaki piękny świat.
Okay, so that system and the others, let's just go on a little bit. That system and the others are used in various different domains. That one was in classroom. It's based on a real person. They built the bot, they built the voice, and it's quite sophisticated. They can all be run from a laptop. I've spoken to Pinkus, the old man, on the silk screen, the big projection, on a laptop. The technology is there. These guys have an SDK to build all of these. This one is an example of the same system, again, being used as for survivors of sexual harassment in the army. It's basically sexual safety training where the bot is a survivor, and the learners, if you like, can freely question any aspect of the bot's experience, and thus the idea is that they're immersed in the idea of being a survivor and what's involved in sexual harassment by literally talking to somebody who's there. And from that, you can create all sorts of training programs. The same kind of tech is used regularly in creating virtual patients for medical training, etc., etc. The list goes on. But why didn't I use YouTube for those? Very simple answer. If you use YouTube, you see the dates those videos were posted. And most of them are 2013 or earlier. So what has happened? Unfortunately, there's been an enormous amount of oxygen taken up by machine learning and chatbots. So lots of really good work is not getting to the mainstream. I mean, ICT, who made those, don't need the money. They're working for DARPA. They're done forever. They'll never need more funding. But there are smaller groups creating very similar work, which is far more imaginative, far more useful. And by the way, the chatbot I showed you, which I checked on the list last night, doesn't work. It's not there anymore. So what I'd like to say here is that chatbots are very, very useful. There are a lot of very, very useful use cases, but, and here is a reference, they may not be always the droids you're looking for. There's a lot more out there. And I'd encourage people to look at what's there and to think about what's there, because there, especially now that everything is going virtual and everything is blended, there are great opportunities to use these almost personal tutors to work with a wide range of learners in a wide range of domains, and to use this time when we're not all bunched in a classroom to actually make the most of it. Because I come from a background of speech tech, obviously, but also from migrant language and integration provision. And migrant learners are generally adults. They're highly motivated, but they have what's called a spiky profile, particularly in language. They need 5 skills in language. And you can have such a range of profiles in the 5 individual skills that any sort of classroom environment is basically teaching to a kind of a common denominator virtual learner. And that happens in every sphere. And this is the opportunity to get around that, make blended learning almost like a clinic situation where an encounter with a teacher is used to its full effect as a pit stop, where really good advice, really sophisticated advice can be given. But outsource repetitive tasks which some more than others will need repetition and practice on, to the tech. So just to finish up, I'm going to go very quickly through a little bit of research here. What I do myself on the research side is I look at what's called interactional conversation. You can generally divide conversation into transactional and interactional conversation. Transactional classically would be something like selling a pizza or buying a pizza. And an awful lot of interactive tech is based around this at the moment, which is why you get the quizzes, you get very simple, closed interactions with the tutors. So the content is vital. It's what you say that matters. But what we do a lot is we talk socially. We talk with neighbors. We tell stories. We maintain social bonds, which in an educational context will really, really help your attention. We deliver the stories in a form that sticks with our users, because the stories are not the answer. They're not a question or an answer. They're longer. They make an impression and they're retained. So most of my work part of one of my jobs is looking at the time traces of conversations with a view to incorporating them in the tech. So the top part of that, if you look at it, it's very choppy. That's closer to what most people would consider chat. There's lots of laughter, there's lots of questions and answers. Each of those lines is one speaker. Green is when they're speaking, gray is when they're silent, and yellow is when they're laughing. But the bottom is when real information transfer starts to happen. People start to tell stories to each other. By looking at this kind of information, and lots of it, we can find things like For example, I was quite shocked to find that the optimum length for one of these stories is half a minute. That has obvious implications for how you deliver content through speech. Don't go like I did at the beginning with that, that incredibly long sentence, not only because you might stop them breathing, but also people might ingest content matter better if you dose it with a view to how speech happens. And I know this happens all the time in good learning design, but it has to be incorporated in the new tech as well. So now, myself, I have another arm, which is we have a startup called BelowHorizon, which we create multimodal interactive language learning agents based on the kind of thing I'm talking about. Now, I don't have DARPA money, so we don't have the visuals, but the back end. The difference with us is we're working very hard, and this is research and commerce, on building the systems around the dialogue system rather than putting the dialogue around the content. So there are all sorts of things we're finding to be very, very useful and very, very helpful there, especially around motivation and the efficiency of the lessons, because we're using long-held teaching methods and activities. There's nothing new in there. It's just when you have a dialogue system, instead of just assessing and testing, you can actually start teaching and helping people to learn. So the last part is, over time of COVID, we decided to set up a not-for-profit where we're working with migrant learners and tutors of migrant learners, building online free lessons using the Miller system. Now, the message I'd like to get from this is the middle one, talking to tutors. I've been talking all the time to further education tutors. Further education tutors are the salt of the earth. They're the people who never had the resources, who always had to adapt everything, who had clients from non-traditional learning backgrounds, who had mixed ability groups, and they are worth their weight in gold. So I would also say, if anybody out there is looking at even workplace learning in time of COVID and needs some subject matter experts, I'd seriously consider adult ed tutors or further ed tutors, because they have been adapting, creating and sharing methods which work for a long, long time, and they're coming into their own now. So that's more or less all I have to say, and I'm very happy to take questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Emer. As I was saying, there's something deeply moving about creating something and then having a chat with it. I heard a story about Michelangelo after finishing his sculpture Moses. It was so lifelike that he tapped it on the knee and commanded it to speak. Perhaps there's, we shouldn't be surprised by that, but certainly it's very interesting to see the use of chatbots extending the use of conversations in a very unstructured and mimicking chat. Emer, I suppose before I go to the audience questions, I know I've heard you say before that it's really important to remember that AI is only ever as good as the underlying data. Yeah. Which in turn, I suppose, can only be created by the expert knowledge. So with that in mind, I suppose, where do you see the skills and areas for growth for the current workforce and also graduates, like where they should be or need to be?
Well, I mean, this is a huge question. I think we always say, AI is usually far more artificial and far less intelligent than you think. That's the old thing. But there are options for work in this field. Now, what's quite interesting at the moment is that there's been huge talk about big data, and everybody is looking desperately for people who can do AI, people who can do machine learning. But we're starting to see, not exactly a backlash, but we're starting to see a realization that any of that depends on, it's the classic engineering. All of that depends on defining the problem correctly. And in order to do that, you have to be an expert on what you're trying to model. Yeah. So I see within the learning sphere, I see opportunities, and I should hope it would happen, is that younger educators start to be involved in curriculum design and development on the E side as well. But of course, engineering, STEM, etc. I'm not a career guidance person, but I would say that I wouldn't hang up the the chalk yet, because we're always going to need the teachers, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't think there's any such thing as completely autonomous remote learning.
No, and it's kind of still, still having that human element as well,
Yeah.
that, we spoke about earlier in the panel discussion as well, is kind of that human factor is ever more important. And the technology can only do so much, but, there still has to be that part of it. A question here from the audience. So, Emer, do you feel people can be disengaged with bot due to the lack of personal feel? That's kind of relative to what we were saying there, and more the kind of connection, and particularly when we're talking about onboarding, for example.
I would say, first of all, I don't hate chatbots, but I have other children in the family that I think are more gifted, such as the stuff, the very old material we saw there, those 7-8-year-old systems, which do engage, do have a personal feel. Now, there are huge data protection and privacy concerns once you start recording people, and there always will be. But I would argue that a bot, for example, even a common or garden chatbot, properly designed, it's good for pacing and it's good for engagement in that way. So that rather than somebody seeing a piece of text, it's good. But if you have a well-designed piece of learning material, multimedia especially, I don't see that being replaced by a bot anytime soon, for one very good reason. If you look at your screen, all bots were designed for Facebook Messenger and other flavors of Messenger. And I've seen things like, I've been asked by companies, could you look at a bot for doing, this sort of search we do or something? And you finally kind of try to gently persuade them, but where are people going to be using this? At their desks. So surely you'd use this huge piece of real estate of an actual tablet or PC screen rather than this tiny little piece in the corner for a bot. So I don't know if that's really answering your question, but I would say that
I think it certainly is. And I suppose, like with organizations who come and work with Learnovate, it is around, as sometimes people feel that there's certain types of technologies that they should be implementing into their organization, but really not understanding the value, as I said before, as to what that technology is going to offer the learner or the organization. And is it going to be suitable for it, rather than, oh, this is a craze, we need to do it. And we've seen that in organizations that have, implemented virtual reality, and really it's not applicable for all cases. So I suppose
we're seeing that a lot with basically it's always the dream. It's always this, we're going to have a person in the classroom that somehow is going to get rid of Sister Rose kind of idea. But these end up in the headmaster's office. Sorry, I'm coming from a sort of a school education perspective. They end up in the headmaster's office as a hat stand, these robots, etc. But there are technologies which are very, very accessible. Any of those very nice systems are very accessible in that they can run on a laptop screen. You can build them out of an SDK. You can also build a standard chatbot out of an SDK. But again, it has to be fit for purpose. It's not just I have a hammer,
Exactly. And I suppose you're leading on to my next question from the audience, was around from early school through to corporate learning. Is there any particular area emerging as early adopters in learning?
Learning with interactive technology?
Yes.
Okay. There are a couple, and they're oddly at opposite ends of the journey, if you like. There is a lot of uptake, particularly with big money, and not so much corporate as government in the States, on the use of these interactive systems for military training. Now, that's interesting in that it has all sorts of offshoots. So you get a lot of medical training with virtual patients, you get a lot of teacher training with virtual students, and it's a lot of it is in that simulation of an eventual workplace. You also get a lot of use of it at the lower end, just like the Mr. Pincus, the old man there, at say K-12 really, or lower, but down around primary school here, because again it's very engaging for the kids. It's not a book; it awakens and elicits an interest, which can then be channeled into more traditional exercises.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, now there is one I'd really recommend you look at called Moxie, which is for children and is a very good example of this kind of thing. But it's not a chatbot again, it's a dialogue system.
Brilliant. I'll definitely be looking at that later on. Another question from the audience was, have you seen corporate incorporating chatbots, and what, in what kind of context?
And again, it's down to this thing. It was a huge craze, and the classic example, I'm beginning to sound like Cassandra here, but the classic example was Slack. Chatbots were brought on in many cases. A chatbot is great to replace an FAQ, a question answer table, not so great to replace a piece of learning that's already been designed and developed well. Yeah. So what was happening was, and it's the old question, it's, do you really want your washing machine to engage you in a conversation before you press start? And the Slack people, so they had this, a lot of the, say, operational tasks in the job were remodeled as chatbots rather than apps. And within a week, most of the staff were kind of, can you give us some kind of slash commands to to just go around this conversation that we really don't want to have? Yeah. And again, it's use it where it's useful. There is interest at corporate levels everywhere in always language teaching using, and again, I'd stress that difference between a dialogue system and a bot. There are places where bots are very useful, but especially as we move back from the sort of the entirely mobile first idea to using larger screens.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, particularly in a multicultural environment as well. And you spoke earlier in your presentation, Emer, around the migrant learners. Can you give us a little bit more information around that, the migrant learners with listenhere.ie?
Oh, listenhere.ie. Sorry, what happened, of course, was I went down a country lane on the explanation of what dialogue systems are as usual. Listen Here is something we set up recently where we use the Mila technology. Now we use an impoverished form in that we don't actually at the moment have, until someone gives us some funding as a charity, we don't really have we have the ability to put in dialogue, and we do in our commercial things where you can talk to the system. You do a lesson and then you can talk to the system about it. We can't really do that just yet on Listen Here, but what we do is we use the Mila platform, which is a dialogue system which can mediate learning events, as it were, and get well-known people and normal people just to give little 1-minute stretches of life in Ireland. So for example, this morning we had Luke O'Neill, the immunologist, talking about how to wear a mask. Yeah. And that then gets turned into a lesson, which then is distributed free of charge to tutors and learners across the country. And the idea is to get away from the problem that the content of most lessons are not about living in Ireland. If you're a refugee, you're not really interested in whether you're using, cash, card, or check to pay for your hotel room. Yeah. You're interested in learning how to call the doctor. So, and the second thing is the accents. Most learning material does not use Irish accents. So it's a kind of a crowdsourcing of the material. So anyone out there who has a story to tell, feel free to give us a minute on it.
That's brilliant. So we're running out of time. I could talk for another 10 or 15 minutes around what you're doing there on that level. But I suppose just to close it off, Emer, thinking ahead of time, what might surprise us when we look back in 30 years' time?
The fact that we're holding a book. No, seriously, I think, yeah. But also that they're like, all of these systems are becoming more and more transparent, if you like. They're just blending in. They're invisible to us. I think privacy is going to be a huge issue for quite a while, but it's quite surprising how little people care about their well, it's surprising when you think about it. Yeah. And I do think that there's going to be maybe a more conscious exchange of, I'm giving you access in order for you to give me services, rather than this under the counter thing we've had for so long. I don't think we're going to be talking to our machines all the time, because it's not necessarily always the most efficient way to do things.
Yeah.
I think I really, really do hope and think that all of these techie things will be used. I don't mean well just in the sense that they're ethical, but also well in the sense that they're appropriate and effective. And I think that's the big industry learning that has to happen about this, around
Yeah,
this.
I think that's the big thing. It's the effectiveness
Yeah.
of this technology.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Emer, for your
Thank you.
time today,
Thank you.
and we'll see you again shortly.